Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to be moving into the area of philosophy, and we're going to be talking about the Allegory of the Cave by Plato. Now, for most people, when you study Western philosophy, when you take an intro class, this is often how that intro class starts, is with the Allegory of the Cave. Just to briefly go through what is the Allegory of the Cave, Plato sort of put this thought experiment together. He said, imagine that all of your life you are chained to the floor in a cave, and the only thing you know is the shapes that move back and forth, the shadows you see moving back and forth on the wall in front of you. And you know nothing else about reality. This is it. Well, he says, imagine that one of the people suddenly gets the ability to get free a little bit. So instead of just seeing the shadows in front of them, they're able to look right and left and see everybody else is chained to the floor the same way they are. Well, they struggle a little bit, get free a little more, and they're able to turn their heads and look behind them. And it takes a minute for their eyes to adjust because behind them is a fire. And this is brighter than anything they've ever seen, so it takes a period of adjustment. But once their eyes adjust, they can see that moving in front of this fire is a series of basically like cutouts that are casting the shadows on the cave wall. And these shadows that are being cast were what up until that point they had thought was reality. So the person struggles a little more because they're curious to see what else is there about reality that they don't know, and they get free and are able to move towards the fire. Now they see that there's things beyond the fire. So they go around and they're walking and they see that there's, a brighter light up ahead. And this brighter light is, coming in from the entrance of the cave. And as they exit the cave, for the first time in their lives, they see the sun and trees and nature and the sky. They see everything the way that it really is, instead of just the shadows that they had known. Well, when someone has that kind of awakening, they have two choices: just to go off on that awakening and be content with the knowledge on their own, but we're social creatures, and so there's a desire to share that awakening. So they decide they need to go back into the cave and tell everybody else what they saw and kind of help free everyone else so that they can see, reality the way it is. So they go back into the cave and they start trying to tell people about reality. Well, one of the things that happens if you take away people's illusions is they don't generally tend to be very happy with you. In fact, you've taken away basically everything they've believed their entire lives, and they tend to be angry and resentful for the most part. And most of the people will refuse the knowledge you want to give them. A few people will go along and follow you and come out of the cave, and they themselves will experience reality. Now, for Plato, this is what philosophy is. It's seeing past the illusions of everyday life and looking at reality the way it really is. Plato saw the world around us as being very imperfect because it changes. Plato refused to believe that anything that changes can be the real reality. So he saw that as being, this must just be an imperfect reflection of that reality. So Plato is someone who believes in the ideal, in the world of forms, as he calls it. There's a chair. There are chairs that we see in the real world, but in the world of forms, there is the ideal of the chair. And every chair that plays out in the real world that we see is just a poor representation of that ideal. Now, this is something that really shapes Western philosophy for a long time. This is something that religion, especially Christianity, picks up on and incorporates into this teachings that this world we live in, this isn't the real world. The real world is, for Christians, the world of God, the world of heaven. That's where things are real and unchanging, and that's the real perfect world. The idea that things could be changing, that things could be imperfect, is something that's difficult to deal with. Well, why is this difficult to deal with? Well, if the world is changing and nothing ever stays the same, where do you ground yourself? You know, if everything gets old and wears down and dies, what is your comfort? And the comfort is, well, that this is just an illusion, that the real world is the world behind the world. It's a world we don't have access to. So Plato's allegory of the cave is often used to show, what is the job of the philosopher. Now, as you look at this, it's easy to see how much everybody's beliefs are shaped by opinion, by things that they've been taught, things that they've been shown. Much of the reality that you experience as reality, you are filtering it through a lens. You are taught and believe that things are a certain way, and so you look for them to be that way. And if they're not, if something happens that challenges that, it challenges the way you see the world. And so you have to, step back and say, well, maybe I'm not seeing things correctly. Maybe I'm, maybe, this didn't really happen. And it also, on a more day-to-day level, it does it does kind of shape what we see and what we don't see. If you think about, when you're sitting wherever you're sitting right now, there are so many objects around you in the room. There are, if you're in a room, there's the things on the wall, the things on the floor, the furniture, people or animals in the room. There's the colors that you're surrounded by. There's the different sounds going on, people talking, sounds that are outside, maybe the sounds of, a television or a radio. And all of this input is kind of going at you 24 hours a day. If you didn't have an ability to focus and to kind of decide this is the important stuff, this is not important stuff, you would just be overwhelmed by your senses. I mean, not only by your sight and sound, but think about the fact of, the feel of the clothes against you. If you're sitting in a chair, the feel of the chair against your body, the temperature of the room, the smells in the air. All of this is too much to focus on. It would leave you pretty much shut down. So we have in our heads, well, these are the important things and these are the unimportant things. We have our biases, and these are generally set by, your parents, your peers, your society. Those are the things we're taught that are the important things, and those are the things we focus on, and we kind of filter the other stuff out. Doesn't mean the other stuff vanishes. The other stuff is still there. We've just put it in our head that we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on something else. And so for Plato, and for philosophy, the idea is, well, let's step back for a minute, because maybe we aren't focusing on the right things, or maybe we're not seeing things the right way because we've just, taken it for granted that this is what things mean. So we, step back and we say, well, that's not important, or this means this, or this means that. How many times have you run into an experience in your life where you just can't make sense of why something happened? Either, maybe you had a friend that suddenly disappear and you never see them again or never hear from them again, and you don't know what happened. And a lot of this has to do with how complicated reality is. Reality, there are lots of things we don't know. And there are lots of things that we just assume. So for philosophy says you have to set that aside. You have to forget about what you think you know, and you have to start exploring more. You have to, get rid of what would later be called, you know, the confirmation biases that we experience. When you want to believe something, when you want to think a certain thing is a certain way, you will look for all of the signs and evidence that confirm it is the way you want to see it. It is the way that you think it is. And confirmation bias is something that is really difficult to get over. In science and medicine, you constantly, this is why the experiments have to be set up the way they are. You can't just say, oh, I found all of this proof that this is true, and then run with it, because you will end up jumping to conclusions that are not true, and you'll end up looking foolish. So you have to put things in place that kind of balance, counterbalance that confirmation bias. So philosophy was one of the first ways of starting to try to do that. How do we see the world the way it really is instead of just seeing it the way we want to see it? And philosophers are human beings. They're not immune to falling into confirmation, bias. And, oh, I see this, tells me what I want to believe, and so this must be true. When I taught college, I taught paper writing classes. I would always tell my students that it's easy to be skeptical of things you disagree with. But when you run into something that you agree with, we tend to just want to say, oh, yeah, we agree with that, and that must be true. So I would tell them that whenever you agree with something, whenever you run into information you agree with, you need to be twice as skeptical of as if it was something you already disagreed with. Now, when I was at the beginning, I talked about how this is back then versus now. Back then we had fewer influences on how we saw the world. We were more connected to the world than we are now. And I know this might sound like, oh, the good old days, we saw things the way they were. They didn't see things the way they were either. They had their short-sightedness, but we have even more things that make it difficult for us, because in the modern world we have a lot of media and social media and things like that that can tell us what we want to hear. If you go onto an online site, if any of the social medias, you're going to tend to gravitate towards people that have the same beliefs that you do. Well, guess what? This belief is just like Plato's cave. It's an electronic cave is the only difference. And so you are now, bombarded with lots and lots of information that tell you what you already believe. The term for it is you get into these echo chambers. If you have a particular view on a political issue, you will gravitate towards people with that same view. So they will tell you over and over again, yes, this is right, this is right. And what happens is this puts you even further into the cave. This puts you even further away from being able to stop and say, am I just blindly following this? Because, it seems like everywhere you turn, there is confirmation. One of the things that is very difficult in philosophy and in the real world is that you have to step back. You have to say, are things really the way that I think they are? Or am I being misled? Am I being taken down this path and there's no basis in fact? The other problem is the more you have this confirmation bias bombarding you, from every direction, the harder it becomes for you to see anybody with a different opinion as having any validity whatsoever. You're going to look at what they say and say, well, they just must be idiots because they believe this. And, their opinion, your opinion, may both be equally false. or they may both have some elements of the truth in them. But when you get put into this cave, especially this electronic modern cave, it becomes very difficult to bridge that gap. And so this idea of Plato that the philosopher has to shake off the chains and turn away from everything that they've assumed is correct for all of their lives, and really try to dig in and see what reality is. This is even more important today than it was back then. And as we go through these episodes, we are going to be looking at lots of different literary philosophical issues, and we are going to be looking at them for their strengths and their weaknesses. Because I can tell you, I've never read a philosopher that I completely agreed with. I always thought they had these ideas were good and these ideas were a little or very misguided sometimes. And that's the way it always is. And this is why I will, throughout these podcasts, keep reminding you, do not take all of your information from one source. Just because a source agrees with you and tells you what you want to hear, find other sources of information too. If you are going on this journey, you're going on this journey probably because you want to have a better grasp of reality. And if all you do is move out of one cave and into a different cave, you really haven't done much. You've just, maybe changed the location of where you're chained to the floor, but you're still chained to the floor. So whenever you read anything, whenever you hear anything, think about it closely as, what are the good points, and compare it to the things you see in your life. Think about the logic. Does it make sense? But then also say, okay, what does somebody else say that counters this? Where are the weaknesses in that logic? Even with me, giving these lectures, I don't expect you to believe everything I tell you. Not because I'm a person who is going to deliberately lead you astray, but because reality is too complex for any one person to know all of it. And so what I'm giving you are some of the ideas of some of the great thinkers and writers throughout history, some of my ideas, and what you should be doing is putting these together with your own ideas, with other people that are, teachers and writers, and, expanding this. Because the goal of these podcasts is not to make a bunch of carbon copies of myself. It's to open doors and to encourage, dialogues between people, real dialogues, not what we unfortunately have mostly in today's society, where one side crosses their arms and says, no, you're an idiot. The other crosses their arms and says, no, you're the idiot. And that's not constructive. That doesn't move anything forward. One of the best things that you can have if you want to move your ideas forward is to have a good opponent in an argument. And by argument, I'm talking about the academic style of argument, not the fighting style of an argument, not where you're just screaming at each other. The academic style of an argument is you have one side presenting their strong points, and then another side refutes those and presents their strong points. Then the first side refutes those and presents more points, and you go back and forth. And what happens when you have a good argument is that you end up with, at the end of it, both people have a better understanding of what's going on. Both people know more than they did when they started. And that's the whole purpose of philosophy. That's the whole purpose of politics, of, you're moving out into the world and kind of trying to come up with the best idea to solve the problem. This is part of the reason that I'm not a fan of top-down systems at all. I think that top-down systems are all destructive, and all for the same reason. Because in order for you to have a small group that is in charge of everything, They have to basically push everybody down below them, to silence them, to dumb them down, to, take away their voice. And the problem with that is nobody knows everything. So when you silence the opinions of those who disagree with you, you might be heading off a cliff and taking everyone with you. You know, a society that does not have a healthy back and forth of ideas, really one way or another will run off a cliff. And generally, the more you have the power concentrated in just a few people or a few thinkers, the more likely that is to be a quick jump off the cliff. Okay, I'm going to break off this episode. One of the things that I am going to be starting to do is I'm going to start doing some episodes that are going to involve grammar and diagramming sentences in particular. Now, as a former English teacher in college, I found that the best way to teach grammar was through diagramming sentences, because you could talk about rules all day long and give people rules to remember, and they wouldn't. Diagramming is a much more hands-on way of doing grammar, where you actually have to look at all of the parts, all of the words in the sentence, and see how they fit together. Now, why would that be important for, going along with the other stuff we're doing in these podcasts? Mainly because grammar is the logic of the language. And if you don't have a good grasp of the logic of your language, how are you going to have a good grasp of other types of argument, of other types of logic? Your language is the basis of it. Another thing I'm going to kind of, state directly is that when we do diagramming, we will be talking about standard English. And standard English is not better English. Standard English is just what the name implies. It's our common language. Everyone speaks dialect, of their language. Everyone who speaks English speaks a dialect of English. And none of those dialects are better than any of the other ones. But the problem with dialects is they don't tend to translate well to people who are of a different dialect. So while within a dialect, what you're saying, everybody in that dialect understands and it makes sense, somebody from a different dialect may have a completely different meaning or have no meaning at all to what you're saying. So we're going to talk about standard English and the grammar of standard English, not because it's better English, but because when you speak to a group that you have no idea what their dialect is, you should be able to be speaking the same language. Because it's very easy, and we're going to talk about this too, as we talk about grammar. We're also going to be talking about how language is more slippery than people realize. It doesn't have the simplified meaning that people often think that it does. So I will be doing some segments on diagramming, and I'll go back and forth between, literature and literary analysis, diagramming, philosophy. This really is intended to be a well-rounded education. I'm starting with the more basic ideas in these first podcasts, and as this goes on, we will start to get more and more in depth in a lot of different areas. We're going to cover not only literature and literary theory, we're going to cover, all kinds of different areas in philosophy. We're going to talk about epistemology. We're going to talk about ethics. We're going to talk about, all kinds of different things, because philosophy really is the foundation of everything as far as modern disciplines. When you get the highest degree you can get in most disciplines, it's a PhD. A PhD stands for philosophy degree. What you're doing when you're studying for a PhD is you are studying the philosophy of that particular field, because all of the fields started in philosophy. So I'm going to end this for now, and like I said, my next episode, I plan to have that one up probably tomorrow, and it will be an episode on diagramming sentences. And then after that, I think I'm going to be probably doing an episode on literary theory and how to do a little bit of analysis of literature based on different types of theory. Okay, I hope all of you are doing well, and I hope all of you are staying safe. Have a good night.